the people of the trees. There is a place somewhere in the wilds of Michigan's Upper Peninsula that is rumored to have mystical powers. The Native Americans refer to this place as hallowed ground, and they feared it greatly. They claimed that anyone who lived in this small area would be granted eternal life. However, the price would be terrible. The early Americans, respectful of this high price, stayed away from this place. In 1877, 12 people from southern Michigan set out for the Upper Peninsula to find this strange, magical area. They'd heard rumors of this wonderful piece of land, a piece of land that seemed to be alive, and somehow allowed its inhabitants to live forever. After several years of searching, they found what they believed was to be the sacred area. They built several crude log houses in a small cluster and lived peacefully among themselves. Years later, in that same small village, a trapper making his rounds came upon the tiny settlement, but there was no sign of anyone at all. As a matter of fact, it looked like the village had been abandoned. All 12 people had disappeared without a trace, and one thing was for certain. None of the 12 achieved their dream of eternal life. Or so it seemed. In 1999, Tyler Welling and Kyle Darden, both of St. Clair Shores, Michigan, met at a campsite in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. They became friends almost instantly. They were both about the same age, they dressed the same, and both liked the same things. One thing they liked best of all, however, was exploring. On a hot summer afternoon in July, the two boys set out on a hike through the thick forest that surrounded their campsite. What they found would become the subject of many rumors, legends, and tales. The day was hazy and gray. Both boys had packed a knapsack that contained first aid kits, several apples, insect repellent, a few candy bars, and 2 canteens of water. They planned to hike several miles along an old footpath that wound deep into the forest. Few hikers dared to venture along the trail for several reasons. The trail was muddy and tough going and very tiring. But more importantly, it was the mosquito season. Mosquitoes in the Upper Peninsula have been known to grow as large as sparrows in some regions and can take nearly a pint of blood from one human in a single bite. The rough terrain nor the bloodthirsty mosquitoes didn't concern Tyler and Kyle. Both were fairly experienced hikers for their age, and both had brought plenty of mosquito spray. Around noon, they set out on their hike to explore the uninhabited forest. Kyle carried a compass, and he expertly marked their directions to keep from getting lost. The going was tough. Ankle-deep mud made the hike slow and tedious. Both boys' shoes were soon caked with thick black goo. After a short time, the two rested for a few minutes. They stopped near a large field that was overgrown with tall grass and brush. The grass was a flat lime color, and a few sparse alder trees grew in several places. But perhaps most interesting was a curious stand of 12 maple trees that grew in a perfect circle in the middle of the field. The tree trunks were big, and high above thick branches spiderwebbed beneath the gray sky. Also scattered about were the remains of what could have been old cabins or small homes. The trees in the foundation seemed very out of place in an otherwise empty meadow. Most peculiar, however, was the fact that all of the trees appeared to be dead. There wasn't a single leaf on any of the branches. The maples looked like they had all been dead for a long, long time. Finding the stand of trees to be a bit odd, the two boys decided to investigate. At the very least, the trees would make for a good climb. Kyle presumed that if they were to ascend high up into the branches, they would be able to see for miles. Perhaps they could even see the huge span of the Mackinac Bridge, some 30 miles to the southwest. They walked through the grass, completely unaware of what they were about to discover. As they approached the circle of trees, a wind began to blow. The maples trembled and shook, and their old branches creaked and cracked. Tyler and Kyle stopped walking and gazed up into the trees. The limbs were weathered and old, and pieces of bark had peeled away in several places. Kyle noticed that some of the branches didn't look like limbs at all, but rather arms and hands. He pointed out several of the curious limbs, and the two boys peered curiously at the wiry branches. Tyler thought that he could make out knuckles and elbows, even wrists and forearms on many of the branches. Both agreed that the trees were very peculiar. Tyler stepped inside the circle of trees. Kyle was thirsty and unzipped his backpack to retrieve his canteen of water. He had just placed the canteen to his lips when he heard Tyler let out a terrible wailing scream. Kyle spun, almost dropping his canteen. Tyler was standing in the circle of trees, eyes wide, staring at something. He was motionless, and except for the hair on his head that was being tossed about by the wind, he was frozen in fear. Kyle quickly dashed to his side. When he saw what Tyler was looking at, he too recoiled in terror. On the trees, or rather, in the trees, were faces. Faces of people. They were too clear, too unmistakable to be anything else. Each tree had a single cold face that stared blankly at the two boys. The faces appeared to be part of the tree itself, as if they'd grown inside the trunk. Tyler and Kyle could see noses, mouths, eyes, and eyebrows. The faces in the trees seemed to be glaring at them, scowling menacingly. Both boys suddenly ran out of the circle and into the open field. Only when they reached the edge of the forest did they feel it safe enough to stop. They turned and looked back at the circle of trees and fallen down shacks, then proceeded to hike through the forest and back to the trail. Hurrying back to the camp, they wasted no time in telling everyone what they'd seen. Not many people believed them. However, Kyle's older sister, as well as Tyler's father, thought that the mysterious faces might be worth a look. They followed the two boys back over the muddy trail. Using the compass, Kyle and Tyler led their two companions through the mosquito-infested swamps back to the field of trees and the strange cabin ruins. Or they tried to, anyway. Because when they reached the meadow, the trees had vanished. The field looked exactly as it did when they had first found it, but the mysterious circle of trees and the dilapidated cabins had simply disappeared. Kyle's older sister complained that she'd wasted her time and demanded to be led back to camp. Tyler's father didn't say anything, but he too was a bit disappointed. Tyler and Kyle insisted they were right, that they had seen the trees, but they couldn't explain how they had vanished into thin air. Kyle checked and rechecked the bearing on his compass, and all four hikers searched the field for any evidence of the 12 trees. The four finally headed back to camp. But the two boys weren't satisfied. Sure, they couldn't explain how the trees and cabins had vanished, but both boys knew for certain what they had seen. They had seen faces in those 12 trees. Faces of people gazing back at them through old, dead tree trunks. 12 faces in all, glaring at them. And so, the very next day, Tyler and Kyle again set out to locate the mysterious circle of trees. The day was clear and the sky was blue. Both boys had passed up going to the beach to swim in favor of returning to the field. They wanted to see the trees again, to prove to each other that they weren't crazy. They wanted to see the faces. Upon reaching the field, the two boys stopped and stared. The circle of trees had returned. They walked through the grass and approached the maples in silence. The trees were stiff and rigid, and there was no breeze to cause the old limbs to sway. Tyler and Kyle walked beneath the claw-like branches, taking slow, deliberate steps. The faces were still there. In each tree, a face was staring back at them, watching them. Kyle wished he had brought his camera so he could have taken pictures. Then he would have proof that the trees, as well as the faces, actually existed. They were about to leave the circle of trees when they were surprised by a sudden snap from above. Both boys turned and looked up, but it was already too late. The tree branches had come alive, swirling above their heads like mad snakes. Each limb had a large, wiry claw at the end. They swarmed in the sky above, sweeping and swaying, diving and darting like live electrical wires. The two boys screamed and tried to run, but there would be no escape. Not today. A branch lunged forward, then another and another, seizing the two boys and muffling their cries for help. Tyler Welling and Carl Darden were never heard from again. There were search parties, helicopters, even the National Guard was involved. All searches came up empty-handed. Tyler Welling and Kyle Darden had vanished without a trace. And to this day, their strange disappearance is a mystery. There are stories, however. Some people say that deep in the mosquito-infested swamps of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, such a place still exists today. Some say that if you look hard enough to find the field, you will come across the circle of trees. You will see the strange, tortured faces in the old, graying tree trunks. But you will not count 12 trees. You will count 14. You will count the faces of 12 very, very old people and the painful, twisted faces of 2 young boys. 2 boys whose curiosity brought them back to find the circle. 2 boys who could not resist the temptation to see the bizarre sight just one more time. And should you happen upon this strange circle of old dead maples, it may be best to stay away. Unless, of course, you would like to live forever among the people of the trees.